In the small town of Crestridge, Georgia, peace was more than just a feeling, it was a way of life. People here found comfort in the predictable, where the most exciting town gossip might revolve around a broken fence or a teenager caught speeding down Main Street. Most families had lived here for generations, embracing the security of knowing everyone by name. If there was a rhythm to Crestridge, it was steady, slow, and unchanging, and the townsfolk loved it that way. At the heart of this quiet place was Sheriff Matthew Holbrook, a 38-year-old lawman who embodied both strength and stability. For the people of Crestridge, Matthew was more than just a figure of authority, he was a symbol of order, someone they trusted implicitly. Over his 5 years as sheriff and almost a decade as a deputy before that, he had come to represent the ideal of a dutiful officer, a protector who'd earned his position through loyalty and hard work. Matthew's life looked perfect from the outside. He had a loving wife, Susan, and 2 young children. Together, they represented the ideal Southern family, complete with Sunday church services and backyard barbecues. But like so many lives that seemed flawless on the surface, the Holbrook family was not without its hidden cracks. Matthew's marriage, once full of passion, had grown distant over the years. He and Susan had drifted into a routine, their days occupied by parenting, community obligations, and the simple but consuming monotony of small-town life. It wasn't an unhappy marriage exactly, but neither was it fulfilling. Susan, ever the devoted mother, had shifted her focus to the children and her social role in town, leaving little time or energy to tend to the bond between herself and her husband. Matthew threw himself into his work, finding in his duties as sheriff a sense of purpose that he could no longer find at home. The routine of protecting and serving Crestridge's residents gave him a satisfaction that had grown rare elsewhere in his life. Yet, there was an emptiness he couldn't ignore, a growing feeling that somewhere along the way, he had lost something vital, some part of himself that made him feel alive. And then, one day, he met Aisha Khan. Aisha was the 19-year-old daughter of the Khan family, Muslim immigrants who had settled in Crestridge a decade ago. The Khans were respected by most but remained somewhat apart from the town's tight-knit social fabric. They owned a small grocery store near Main Street, where they worked long hours to make ends meet. The family was conservative, with Aisha's parents, Imran and Fatima, holding tightly to their cultural and religious values. But Aisha was different. She had grown up caught between her parents' expectations and her own desire for freedom and independence. Aisha was bright, ambitious, and restless. She dreamed of leaving Crestridge, of going to college, of seeing a world beyond the confines of her small town. She was a young woman searching for something more, longing for a life that extended beyond the traditions and restrictions she'd known all her life. Yet, for now, her world was limited to Crestridge and her family's grocery store. It was a minor theft at the Khan family store that first brought Aisha and Matthew together. Matthew was called in to investigate, a routine visit that, to most, seemed insignificant. But from the moment he met her, he was captivated. Aisha had a quiet intensity about her, a fire that simmered beneath her calm exterior. Her eyes sparkled with a blend of curiosity and defiance, and she wasn't afraid to look him directly in the eyes when she spoke. She was nothing like the other young women in Crestridge, and he found himself drawn to her energy, her sharp wit, her eagerness to engage with the world in ways that others did not. In the days following that first encounter, Matthew found himself returning to the Khan family store, always with some small excuse to stop by. At first, their conversations were innocuous, small talk about town gossip, light-hearted questions about the quirks of Crestridge life. Aisha would ask him about his work, his experiences in law enforcement, and the people he met on his rounds. Matthew found himself sharing more than he intended, intrigued by her curiosity and charmed by her intelligence. For Aisha, the attraction was undeniable as well. Sheriff Holbrook was different from anyone she knew. He was older, worldly, and embodied the very sense of authority and freedom that her life lacked. He wasn't like the young men her parents had occasionally tried to introduce her to. He was someone who represented something beyond her life, something she wanted but couldn't fully grasp. Their initial conversations soon evolved, crossing invisible lines as an unspoken tension began to build between them. Matthew began to find himself lingering longer and longer at the store, drawn to Aisha in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying. The secrecy of their encounters added to the allure, the thrill of a relationship that he knew was forbidden but couldn't resist. One night, after a long day at the office, Matthew found himself driving by the store. It was late, and the town was dark and silent, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty roads. He saw a light still on inside the Khan's grocery store and decided to stop. Aisha was there, alone, closing up for the night. She looked surprised but pleased to see him, and they exchanged a few quiet words, aware of the silence around them. A palpable tension hung in the air, a line they both knew they were close to crossing. In that moment, standing in the dimly lit store, Matthew felt something shift. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a simple touch that set off a chain of events they couldn't undo. The first kiss they shared was hesitant, almost as if testing the boundaries of what felt right and what felt forbidden. But that small gesture was enough to break down the dam that had been holding back their feelings. From that night on, everything changed. They began meeting in secret, slipping away to places outside Crestridge where they could be anonymous. Late at night, they would exchange hurried texts, careful to hide any trace of their connection. Their relationship quickly grew in intensity, from quiet conversations to late-night rendezvous, and eventually into something deeper, more physical. Matthew found in Aisha everything he had been missing: excitement, passion, a feeling of being wanted in ways he hadn't felt for years. But the more their relationship deepened, the more dangerous it became. They both knew the risks. Matthew was a public figure, and Aisha was the daughter of a conservative family. If anyone found out, it would ruin him. Yet, the thrill of their secret affair was too intoxicating to resist. As the weeks turned into months, Aisha began to feel the weight of secrecy. For her, the affair was a way to rebel, a taste of freedom, but also a trap that held her between two worlds: her loyalty to her family and her growing love for Matthew. She knew that their love was fleeting, that they were walking a tightrope with no safe way to land. Yet, despite the fear and guilt, the passion they shared seemed to overshadow everything else. Neither of them could see the tragedy that was quietly closing in. As their secret affair continued, Matthew and Aisha's lives became entwined in ways they hadn't foreseen. The intensity between them grew, pulling them both into a passionate yet perilous bond. For Aisha, what began as a taste of rebellion had transformed into something far more complicated, a relationship she could neither abandon nor fully embrace without risking everything. Aisha's parents had become increasingly focused on her future. They started introducing her to young men from the local Muslim community, well-meaning suitors who would bring honor to the family and uphold the traditional values her parents cherished. But for Aisha, each meeting felt like a prison sentence. She couldn't see herself with any of these men, couldn't imagine living a life that adhered to the expectations her parents had for her. The thought of being confined to the boundaries of Crestridge for the rest of her life weighed on her, a heavy reminder of the limited paths she was allowed to take. Meanwhile, Matthew's life was unraveling in its own way. The toll of living a double life began to show. He was a man who had always prided himself on order and discipline, but as his affair with Aisha deepened, his grasp on control slipped further. His marriage with Susan, which had once been his source of stability, had become a daily reminder of his deceit. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, and each day, the weight of his secrets grew heavier. Susan, perceptive and patient, had started to notice the subtle changes in Matthew. He came home later, often making excuses about extra paperwork or unexpected incidents around town. He was distant, detached, and there was a coldness in his interactions with her and the children that hadn't been there before. Susan tried to bridge the gap, hoping to bring them closer, but each attempt seemed to only push him further away. Late one night, Matthew found himself sitting alone in his car, parked at the edge of a secluded road just outside town. The silence around him was deafening, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets and the soft hum of his car's engine. He stared at the road ahead, feeling trapped by his own choices. A part of him wanted to walk away, to break free from the affair that threatened to ruin everything he had built. But as soon as he thought of Aisha, her laughter, the spark in her eyes, the way she made him feel alive, he couldn't bring himself to end things. For Aisha, the affair was a way to claim something for herself, a taste of freedom that her life in Crestridge couldn't provide. Yet, she knew it couldn't last. Matthew was married, older, and tied to a town that would never accept their relationship. She felt a growing unease, a nagging sense that the life she dreamed of was slipping further from her reach. The more she was with Matthew, the more isolated she became from her family and her community. One evening, her mother, Fatima, sat her down. With a gentle but firm tone, she asked Aisha about her future, mentioning a young man she had met through friends who would be a perfect match for her. Aisha nodded politely, doing her best to hide her discomfort, but the conversation left her shaken. She realized how little freedom she truly had, how her life seemed to be spiraling out of her control. Her relationship with Matthew had offered her a sense of agency, yet it also anchored her to a future she wasn't sure she wanted. The secrecy began to suffocate her. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between her love for Matthew and the knowledge that it couldn't last. Her parents would never accept him, and he would never abandon his family. The affair had become a double-edged sword, a source of thrill and a trap that threatened to tear her apart. As the weeks went by, Matthew grew increasingly desperate. He sensed Aisha's hesitation, her growing unease, and feared that he was losing her. He started to visit her family store more frequently, finding excuses to talk to her even when it was risky. He began suggesting that they could find a way to be together openly, though he knew, deep down, that it was impossible. The fear of losing Aisha gnawed at him, feeding a desperation he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't bear the thought of returning to a life without her, a life of hollow routines and unspoken loneliness. Aisha, too, felt the strain. She had always craved independence, yet here she was, entangled in a relationship that demanded secrecy, deceit, and endless caution. She started pulling away, emotionally and physically, hoping to create a distance that might make it easier to let go when the time came. But each time she tried, Matthew would reach out, meeting her with a longing that made her hesitate. The feelings she had for him were deep, rooted in a mix of admiration and rebellion, love and fear. Their stolen moments became a bittersweet ritual, an intoxicating dance that neither could abandon. Each meeting was filled with a mixture of passion and dread, as if they both sensed the looming storm but were powerless to stop it. They drove to neighboring towns where no one knew them, shared late-night conversations filled with whispered promises, and held each other in the darkness, clinging to a love that was as thrilling as it was forbidden. But with each passing day, the weight of their choices became harder to bear. For Matthew, the fear of exposure haunted him. If the townsfolk of Crestridge ever discovered his affair with Aisha, it would destroy not only his career but his family. He was a public figure, a sheriff, trusted and respected by the community. The thought of losing everything he had built, of the shame he would bring upon his family, was unbearable. Aisha, too, felt the pressure mounting. The world she had crafted with Matthew was a fragile one, built on secrets and stolen moments. The consequences of discovery would be catastrophic, not just for him but for her as well. Her family, deeply rooted in their beliefs and traditions, would be devastated if they found out. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to let go. The relationship had come to define her, giving her a sense of purpose and control she had never felt before. It all came to a head one evening, in the quiet hours after the store had closed. Matthew found himself once again standing at the threshold of the Khan family store, his heart pounding as he waited for Aisha to emerge. She stepped out, her eyes dark with a mixture of anticipation and fear. They embraced, their touch a desperate plea for comfort, for reassurance in a world that seemed to be closing in on them. But in that moment, they both knew they were on borrowed time, that their love was a fragile flame flickering in the wind. As they held each other, Aisha whispered words that sent a chill down Matthew's spine. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice barely audible. "One day, someone will find out, and it will ruin us both." Matthew didn't respond immediately. He could feel the walls of his life closing in, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. In his heart, he knew she was right. Yet, the thought of walking away, of returning to a life without her, was a pain he couldn't face. They parted that night, each carrying the silent knowledge that their affair had reached a dangerous tipping point. Both understood that a decision had to be made soon. They could no longer balance on the edge, pretending that the consequences of their actions would never catch up to them. Neither of them could know that the darkest part of their story was just beginning, a series of events set in motion that neither love nor secrecy could protect them from. The morning was quiet when a jogger stumbled upon Aisha's lifeless body by the riverbank. Half submerged in the shallow waters, her face was pale and still, framed by her soaked, dark hair. For a brief, hopeful moment, the jogger thought she might simply be asleep, but the cold stillness of her body made it clear she was beyond help. The horror of it hit him slowly, and with trembling hands, he dialed 911. The Crestridge Sheriff's Department responded swiftly. Sheriff Matthew Holbrook was among the first to arrive, his heart pounding as he approached the scene. He kept his professional facade intact, though inside, a wave of dread and disbelief washed over him. Aisha lay there, lifeless and serene, as if placed in the water intentionally. To anyone else, it might have looked like a tragic accident or a quiet drowning, but Matthew knew better. The truth clawed at him with unrelenting force, a dreadful certainty he couldn't escape. Dr. Harold Banks, the town's coroner, arrived soon after. He observed Aisha's body with a practiced eye, noting the absence of immediate signs of struggle or violence. Yet something didn't feel right. He'd seen enough cases to recognize when something was off, and Aisha's death didn't fit the pattern of a simple accident. After a brief examination, he ordered her body to be transported to the county morgue for a full autopsy, hoping to find some clue that would explain her untimely death. Matthew remained composed on the outside, giving a formal statement to the press and offering condolences to the Khan family. He vowed to lead a thorough investigation into Aisha's death, but inside, he was crumbling. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, to somehow undo the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. But he knew there was no escaping the truth. If anyone looked closely enough, they would uncover the secret they had shared. And when that happened, his life, his career, his family, would be left in ruins. Detective Eleanor Marsh, a seasoned investigator from a neighboring county, was called in to assist. She arrived with a reputation for her sharp instincts and ability to cut through deception, no matter how well hidden. From the moment she set foot in Crestridge, Marsh sensed something was wrong. The town itself seemed quiet, almost too quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath, hiding some dark truth beneath the surface. Marsh began her investigation by interviewing Aisha's family. They were devastated, and her parents were inconsolable. Aisha's mother, Fatima, sobbed quietly as her father, Imran, described the last few months of his daughter's life. He mentioned how she had become withdrawn and secretive, how she had avoided conversations about her future and seemed weighed down by something she couldn't share. Aisha's friends painted a similar picture. They recalled how she'd hinted at a relationship with someone older, a mysterious figure she had never named. She'd confided in her closest friend, Lila, about her confusion and fear. According to Lila, Aisha felt trapped, torn between her feelings and the obligations her family expected her to uphold. She had grown anxious and afraid, her mind heavy with the burdens she carried alone. Marsh's instincts told her that Aisha's death wasn't an accident. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends that didn't quite add up. But without concrete evidence, her suspicions were just that, suspicions. The autopsy results would take time, and for now, all she could do was keep digging, hoping that something would lead her to the truth. Meanwhile, Matthew's life spiraled out of control. His wife, Susan, had noticed the changes in him more than anyone else. His late nights, his distracted demeanor, his inability to focus at home, she didn't know the reason for it, but she knew something was deeply wrong. Susan's gentle questions turned into more pointed inquiries, her patience thinning with each passing day. Matthew, unable to offer any explanation that would satisfy her, withdrew even further, his guilt manifesting as irritation and paranoia. But it was the investigation that truly terrified him. As sheriff, Matthew had access to all the evidence. He knew what lay in the file, knew the risks that each new piece of information brought. With each passing day, he felt his control slipping, the life he'd so carefully constructed falling apart. He knew that if anyone uncovered the truth about his relationship with Aisha, it would be the end of everything. Desperate to protect himself, Matthew decided to take matters into his own hands. Late one night, he entered the evidence locker, using his position to access Aisha's personal effects. Among the items recovered from the scene was her phone, water-damaged but not beyond repair. The investigators hadn't yet managed to retrieve the data, but Matthew knew what would be there if they did: their messages, every conversation they had shared, every word they'd said to each other in secret. With trembling hands, he accessed her phone and deleted the evidence, erasing their messages and any trace of their connection. He then quietly disposed of the device, discarding it far from the sheriff's office, in a place where no one would find it. He told himself it was the only way to protect his family, to preserve the life he'd built. But as he left, he knew that his actions had only tightened the web of lies around him, pulling him deeper into a spiral from which there was no escape. As Marsh continued her investigation, she grew more certain that Aisha's death was no accident. She began piecing together a picture of a young woman who had felt cornered, torn between her family's expectations and the weight of a secret relationship. When she interviewed one of Matthew's deputies, he hesitantly mentioned that Matthew had been acting strangely, taking late-night drives and disappearing without explanation. The deputy had noticed Matthew meeting with Aisha on more than one occasion, though he hadn't thought much of it at the time. The evidence was mounting, and Marsh's suspicions grew. She began to investigate Matthew directly, watching his movements, looking for inconsistencies in his statements. Her instincts told her he was hiding something, but without concrete proof, he remained beyond reach. A breakthrough finally came when Marsh accessed Aisha's financial records. She discovered a hidden bank account in her name that had been receiving regular, sizable deposits over the past few months. The money trail led her back to Matthew, revealing a financial connection that linked them directly. It was clear that Matthew had been supporting Aisha, though for what purpose, Marsh could only guess. Armed with this new evidence, Marsh confronted Matthew, laying out the financial records and the testimonies of those who had seen him with Aisha. Matthew denied everything, insisting the money was unrelated, that he had no deeper connection with Aisha. But Marsh pressed harder, pointing out inconsistencies in his story, the timeline that didn't match up, and the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence. Just as it seemed the truth was within reach, the autopsy results came in, revealing a shocking twist: Aisha hadn't drowned. She had been poisoned, a slow-acting toxin that had accumulated over time and led to her death just days before her body was found. The toxin was rare, and further investigation traced its source back to the Khan family store. Marsh was stunned. She had spent weeks unraveling the web around Matthew, convinced that he was responsible for Aisha's death, only to discover that the truth lay elsewhere. Her investigation took a new turn, leading her to Aisha's father, Imran. In a chilling confession, Imran admitted he had discovered the affair between Aisha and Matthew and had decided to take matters into his own hands, slowly poisoning his daughter to rid the family of shame. The revelation shook Crestridge to its core. Matthew, though not responsible for Aisha's death, was left in ruins. His affair with her was exposed, and his life fell apart as the town turned its back on him. He resigned as sheriff, his marriage disintegrated, and he became a shadow of the man he once was, haunted by the choices that had led him to this point. The news of Aisha Khan's tragic death and the circumstances surrounding it spread through Crestridge like wildfire. The people of the town, who had once trusted Sheriff Matthew Holbrook implicitly, now saw him as a disgrace. He had been their protector, the embodiment of stability and order, but now his secret affair with a young woman nearly half his age had destroyed that carefully cultivated image. His betrayal was a blow to the community, not only because of his position but because of the values they thought he upheld. The scandal rocked Crestridge, leaving behind a bitter sense of disillusionment and mistrust. Imran Khan's arrest was yet another shockwave. A quiet, devout man who had worked tirelessly to provide for his family, Imran had been respected, even if he had kept somewhat to himself. To the townsfolk, he had always seemed proud, a little distant perhaps, but grounded by his faith and dedication. That he could harm his own daughter in a twisted attempt to restore honor devastated the community and shattered any lingering illusions of peace. Now, he was a broken man, sitting in a county jail, waiting for trial, a father who had taken his daughter's life in a misguided effort to protect his family's reputation. The revelation of the affair and the murder left no one untouched, especially Matthew. Forced to resign in disgrace, he found himself an outcast in the very community he had once served. His marriage to Susan crumbled under the weight of betrayal and humiliation. She could no longer look at him without seeing the man who had jeopardized his family for the thrill of a secret love. The anger and hurt she felt were beyond words, and no amount of apologies or explanations could bridge the chasm that had grown between them. In the quiet aftermath of Matthew's resignation, Susan filed for divorce, determined to rebuild her life without him. She moved back to her family's home with their children, hoping to give them some semblance of stability after the turmoil that had torn their lives apart. Her once strong sense of belonging in Crestridge was now tainted by whispers and pitying looks, and she knew that staying here would only deepen the scars. Left alone in the town where he had once been a respected figure, Matthew became a shadow of his former self. He wandered the streets like a ghost, avoiding eye contact with people who would cross the street rather than meet his gaze. The isolation he felt was profound, yet he could find no one to blame but himself. His choices had led him down a path of destruction, and he was forced to face the consequences alone. For Aisha's mother, Fatima, the tragedy was unbearable. She was left to mourn her daughter while grappling with the unimaginable betrayal of her husband, who now sat in a jail cell, unrepentant and convinced he had acted righteously. She couldn't reconcile the image of the man she had married with the one who had taken their daughter's life. The weight of grief and shame drove her to withdraw from the community, retreating into the quiet solitude of her home. The grocery store, once a symbol of their family's resilience and success, closed its doors, its shelves gathering dust as if in silent mourning. The people of Crestridge tried to make sense of what had happened, but the scandal lingered like a dark cloud. Matthew's betrayal, Aisha's murder, and Imran's twisted sense of honor exposed the fault lines in their seemingly tranquil community. People spoke in hushed tones about cultural differences, about love and power, about how such a terrible chain of events could have unfolded in their peaceful town. The affair and the murder forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about loyalty, trust, and the weight of secrets. For Detective Eleanor Marsh, the case left a mark she couldn't shake. She had come to Crestridge determined to find the truth, and in the end, she had uncovered more than she had bargained for. The case was closed, but it felt anything but complete. She had spent weeks piecing together the fragments of Aisha's life, tracing the hidden paths of her relationship with Matthew, and unveiling the toxic grip of family honor that had ultimately led to her death. Yet, even with the truth exposed, the resolution felt hollow. As she drove away from Crestridge, Marsh couldn't help but reflect on the people left behind in the wake of the investigation. She thought of Aisha, a young woman with dreams beyond the confines of her small town, whose life had been extinguished by the forces she couldn't control. She thought of Matthew, a man who had let his own desires drive him to ruin, blinded by passion and the thrill of secrecy. And she thought of Imran, whose misguided sense of duty had driven him to commit an unspeakable act, forever branding him as a murderer in the eyes of those who had once respected him. Crestridge was forever changed, marked by the scars of a tragedy that no one could have predicted. The townsfolk, who had once prided themselves on their close-knit community, were left wary and distrustful, haunted by the knowledge that darkness could lurk even in the most familiar faces. The scandal would fade with time, but the memory of what had happened would linger, a cautionary tale, a reminder of how hidden desires, cultural pressures, and unchecked passions could converge to create devastation. In the years that followed, the memory of Aisha Khan and Sheriff Matthew Holbrook became something of a legend in Crestridge. Young people who hadn't known Aisha would whisper about her by the riverbank where her body had been found, spinning stories of forbidden love and betrayal. The truth of the affair, the murder, and the fractured lives left behind became woven into the town's folklore, a dark thread in the tapestry of Crestridge's history. But for those who had lived through it, the tragedy was more than just a story, it was a painful reminder of lives shattered and futures lost. For Matthew, each day was a struggle to find meaning in the wreckage he had created. He lived on the fringes, barely acknowledged, a man who had once stood for justice but now bore the weight of his own failings. And for Susan and her children, rebuilding their lives meant moving forward, but always with the shadow of what had happened looming over them. Fatima Khan eventually left Crestridge, seeking solace and a new beginning far from the place where her life had unraveled. She carried with her the memory of her daughter, and the hope that somewhere, somehow, she could find peace amidst the heartbreak. The grocery store remained closed, its sign faded, a silent memorial to the life Aisha had once known. As for the town itself, Crestridge tried to move on, returning to the quiet routines it had once cherished. But beneath the surface, an unease lingered, an awareness that even the calmest waters could hide dangerous depths. The memory of Aisha's tragic death served as a haunting reminder of the consequences of secrecy and the fragile line between desire and destruction.